Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. So today we have a seminar on Australia's relations with China. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land on which the University of Sydney sits. And I pay my respect to elders of past, present, and emerging. My name is Jingdong Yuan, and I am a member of the China Studies Center at the University of Sydney. And today we are very pleased to have Professor David Fitzsimmons of Sejong University in Seoul, Republic of Korea, to talk about his upcoming book, which will be published very soon, I think. The title is Australia-China Relations, The Illusion of Choice, 1972 to 2022. This book comes at a very timely moment. As China and Australia mark the 50th anniversary of their diplomatic relations. And so this is an important milestone. But we all know that in the past, perhaps 6 to 7 years, the bilateral relationship has undergone a period of significant challenges. And so I think David and his book, the subject, will offer a very timely analysis, primarily from the perspective of Australian government, and basically to look at the structural, the international environment, the structural factors. For instance, the China-US relations or Australian-US alliance, but also at the national level, the role played by leadership, the prime ministers, foreign ministers, and other key members of the government, and plus the public opinions, academic, and think tanks, analysts. So all of these have had important impact on the choices that Australian government has made over the past 5 decades. We have now a new Labour government since May this year. And we have seen some positive signs of some thawing of the bilateral relationship. At least the foreign ministers and defense ministers and other high-level officials have been meeting with one another, which clearly should be welcomed. And as we, within a few months, we'll be marking that important anniversary, that is December 2022. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome David to talk about his research, and certainly welcome him back virtually to the University of Sydney, where he had conducted most of the research on this topic. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Professor Jingdong Yuan. It's great to see you again, and I'm so glad that I could have the opportunity to do this event with the China Studies Center at the University of Sydney in Australia. So let me go straight into some of my research. And before I start talking about the book and my research, I just want to touch upon 2 key words in the title of my book. And these 2 key words are important because it illuminates the key themes of the book and some of the other key aspects that are woven throughout my book. So let's look at the first word, which is illusion. So when we think of illusion, we can think of it in two ways. The first way is to think of it as a thing that is or is likely to be wrongly perceived or interpreted by the senses. So this kind of gives a magical illusion kind of theme. The second one from the Cambridge Dictionary simply states that an illusion is an idea or belief that is not true. So that's the first word. So think about the word illusion and what that means in the context of this book. The second key word is choice. So choice, when we think of choice, according to the Oxford and Cambridge Dictionary, it means an act or the possibility of choosing something. So illusion and choice. Now, the theoretical framework is important, and I just wanted to briefly discuss that. So I based my book on the simple theoretical framework, a hybrid framework of non-sticky historical institutionalism. And this NSHI theory was coined by Stephen Bell over a decade ago. And I used it for this book to look at the impact of leadership and the impact of the bureaucratic machinery of the government. But also I looked at the two-level game theory. So I looked at both of these theories and applied it to the key variables of Australia's China policy, which brings us to the next slide, which is what are Australia's China policy variables? The first variable, which was pointed out in Professor Jin Dong-yun's opening address, is international politics, global politics, or changing international politics. The second point is domestic politics, what happens on the national level in Australia. And of course, the third aspect, which is very important, is prime ministerial leadership and other key influences in the government. These are the key China policy variables. Now, alongside these three variables, there are sub-variables, such as the US-Australia alliance and other variables that kind of highlight the importance of these three key variables. And there is an interplay between these key variables. So I make the argument in my book that you cannot separate these variables from each other. They both complement and compete with one another in developing and creating headwinds in Australia's China policy. But before we can think about Australia's current China policy, it's important to look at how we got to where we are in the Australia-China relationship. So I briefly want to look at Australia's past China policies. Starting with Gough Whitlam's China policy from 1972 to 1975. And without laboring too much on the complexities and the historical aspects of this Prime Minister's China policy, I just want to highlight key words that reflect what happened in Gough Whitlam's China policy. The first word that comes to my mind and a lot of other people's minds is revolutionary. Gough Whitlam is rightly regarded as the father of Australia-China relations. And he had a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish in his China policies at that time. But it was also very risky. There was a lot of political uncertainty in Gulf Whitlam's push to open up diplomatic relations between Australia and China because of the differences between the governments in Canberra and in Beijing. So there was an element of risk. But at the same time, Gulf Whitlam was very realistic. He realized that the only way to move forward with the China relationship was to engage with China and to engage primarily in trade relations and to push and to open up trade between the two countries. So after creating a few years of extraordinary openings between the two countries and starting the trade relationship in a fundamental way, there was a new prime minister after 3 years, Malcolm Fraser. And his China policy obviously built upon Whitlam's China policy. He could see what Whitlam had done. And even though he had criticized Whitlam for being too quick to open up to China, once he became prime minister, he also saw great opportunities. And he saw, again, the trade opportunities, which he pushed with great vigor and zeal. After 8 years in power, we have the new Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, from 83 to 91. And if I could sum up Bob Hawke's contribution and his vision for China, then he was very visionary in how he saw the China relationship. In an interview I did with Bob Hawke in 2017, he talked about his evolving thoughts on China in the early 1980s and how he was very keen to continue what Fraser had done before him. So he transformed Australia's China relationship. At the same time, China was also opening up to the West. So he took hold of the great opportunities and the great changes coming out of China. And he was able to marry the developments in Australia and the developments in China in a way that complemented both countries' economies and also the diplomatic side and engagement between the two countries. So he was able to carve out a trade and diplomatic complementary system. And he was one of the first prime ministers, Australian prime ministers, to do this in a tangible way, where he separated the trade issues alongside the diplomatic issues and tried to set them apart so that they wouldn't interfere with each other too much. And of course, we know that when things did get difficult between Australia and China, he was able to move forward with the relationship and not allow the Australia-China relationship to become derailed. He was able to mend ties as much as possible. So the fundamentals of the relationship stayed firm and stayed true, even though there was a lot of choppy waters on the surface of the Australia-China relationship. Now, these difficult moments between Australia and China, as we can see in 1989, and even afterwards, Bob Hawke was able to deal with the leadership in Beijing, deal with the Chinese leaders, and smooth things over so that when he finished in 1991, Paul Keating, who took over, was able to move forward without too much disruption to the relationship. However, Paul Keating had his own take. So as you can see, Paul Keating pushed for Asian engagement and a revitalization of the relationship. Now, moving forward, I just want to touch on John Howard's China policy, he really created his own mantra, which is not having to choose between the US and China. And he continued what Hawke did in many ways, separating security from trade issues. And Howard did not believe in the inevitability of choice. He thought that was an illusionary choice. Australia didn't have to choose between the US and China. It could make China choices without damaging the overall bilateral relationship, as long as it went about the right way. Moving on to Kevin Rudd's China policy. And in many ways, I would highlight Kevin Rudd's China policies as very prophetic. As a fluent Mandarin speaker and a keen observer of Chinese politics, and having lived in China, he was very aware of the China challenges and the Chinese opportunities in his government. But he also was at times a brutal realist of having to deal with China and how he thought was the best way to deal with China. And this created some tensions in 2008, 2009. And you can read about that in the book, how he dealt with those tensions and how he overcame those tensions. And one of the sections in the Rudd chapter, which is very interesting, was his top secret Chinese strategic cabinet report, which he developed as soon as he came into government. And he worked on that for 3 years. So he thought long and hard about the Australia-China relationship, and he really desired to build a long-lasting trade and security relationship with China, despite the differences that he had with the Chinese government. Moving on to Julie Gillard's China policy, which was a distinct break in many ways. Her approach was more business-minded, trying to obviously work on a free trade agreement, push that forward. Sometimes it was ambiguous at the beginning of her prime ministership, but in the final year or year and a half, she was able to secure several diplomatic wins in the relationship. So she was also able to move the relationship forward, even though that she was cautious in her policy documents compared to Kevin Rudd in some of his policy documents, namely the 2009 defense white paper. And then we had Tony Abbott's China policy, and I summarize it as an element, 3 key elements of fear, greed, and hope. He feared the rise of China, but he saw the amazing monetary value in China, obviously, and he wanted to work in that relationship. And he also had hope that Australia could further consolidate the diplomatic and political relationship with China that complemented the continuing economic growth in Australia-China trade relations. Now we come to a very important critical juncture in the Australia-China relationship. And even though there were ups and downs in the relationship, when Malcolm Turnbull came to power, the relationship between Canberra and Beijing was at a very good level, and things were looking on the up and up. However, Turnbull was also realistic, and a lot of people see it as a gear shift in his China policy. The first half of his prime ministership being very warm with China, very open with China, talking about the opportunities between Australia and China. But then things started to change in the last year and a half, where people saw his government standing more up to China or disagreeing with China or taking a stronger line on certain domestic or international issues in the Australia-China relationship. But interestingly enough, Turnbull also was able to to have a close relationship with the Chinese leadership, especially Chinese President Xi. And it was during this period that the Turnbull government really created a strategic and a blueprint for other Western countries to follow. So from this period, and even from the Howard period, Australia became a global case study in its dealings with China. During the Scott Morrison period, we see a lot of changes, a lot of international changes, domestic changes. And this debate of sovereignty and compliance really came to the forehead. And there was a lot of debate on Australia's sovereignty and its compliance in its relationship with China. And of course, the biggest upheaval in the international environment was the COVID-19 pandemic, which really highlighted some of the challenges that had been festering under the surface, but were brought to the surface because of the Scott Morrison's call for a coronavirus inquiry to be held over China's handling of the original COVID-19 outbreak. And that put the governments in a medium to deep freeze. And there was a lot of issues, a lot of media talk, and not a lot of high-level talks between the two governments. So from early 2020 up until May 2022, the relationship went into a deep freeze, and there was a lot of opportunities that were missed because of the lack of dialogue between the two governments. So Scott Morrison took the concept of standing up to China to a higher level than Turnbull did, and he really wanted to show that he was obviously a firm leader, looking after Australia's national interest, and that he was going to stand up to not just China, but any other country that he saw was going against Australia's national interest. So this was a pivotal moment in the relationship. And here we see, obviously, the strengthening of the Australia and US alliance and the AUKUS agreement, which happened relatively late in 2021. But this was a very important moment where he used this agreement to highlight the close ties that Australia shares between the UK and especially the US in its diplomatic and military ties. So this is an overview of where we are now. And currently, Australia's current China challenge in a post-coronavirus world. And this is what I look at in my final two chapters. So I wanted to focus on this now. And I think that these three words and these three aspects shine a light into the complicated, but also developing and changing relationship between Australia and China. The first point is reset. We hear a lot about a reset between Australia and China. When is this reset going to happen? And when I think of reset, I think of balancing and repairing. So throughout Australia's history of China, there have been moments of reset. Every prime minister has tried to reset the relationship so that they are looking after their own interests, but also compromising to a certain level for the other country's interests. The second one is resist. Australia has also resisted China in some ways. It is balanced and used very vigorous hedging against China. And this has been consistent over the last 50 years, but it's become more apparent over the last 5 years. There's also an aspect of retaliation, and we can see that in trade moves between the two countries, reactionary moves and tit-for-tat moves. So thinking about these points, it leaves us with some very important questions, tough questions that we need to ask about Australia's future China policy. And the first question that I raise in my book is, does Australia even have a choice? And is Australia in a position where it can control its own destiny over the coming decades? Second question, is Australia independent enough from both China and the US that it can become a more independent ally depending on the changed international environment and domestic issues that happen during different terms of government and during the transition of a new government? And the next question, is it an illusionary choice? Choosing between China or the US or both? Is it possible? Have we already done it? Have we chosen the US over China? Or have we chosen China over the US, depending on the particular period of time and the situation that we're confronted with? And how can Australia construct a sustainable China policy in the age of Chinese President Xi? So these questions lead us to Australia's new China policy. And this is something I touch on in the last two chapters. And I look at it this way, a marriage of convenience in an age of political comb-overs or political disorder. And I think what is really exciting with the new government in Canberra is that there is a possibility that the new Labor-led Albanese government and the Defence Minister and the key cabinet ministers, as well as those in the top positions and the top departments of the government, such as DFAT and Defence, are thinking about ways that they can engage with China. And I put across 8 ways that I think Australia and China can work together on. And I think this can help Australian government develop a closer relationship in the future with China, despite the differences and the periods of tension that have come before 2022. So the first one is Australia could find some common ground to cooperate with China in key areas such as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and UN peacekeeping efforts. Second, increased joint military exercises in both Australia, but also in China. Now, that has never happened before, but if there is more collaboration in some areas, then in the future, it might be possible to hold some joint military exercises in China or near China. Third, the countries might work closer together on migration issues. Fourth, Australia and China could work together on the containment of pandemic diseases and anti-terrorism operations, which they have done so in the past. Fifth, Australia can and should invest more heavily in developing the nation's diplomatic understanding of China and Greater Asia. And this is something which the government can do a lot more work on. Sixth, Australia as a sovereign nation should invest far more heavily in counter-security measures to secure its interests, irrespective of the other actor. So irrespective of whether it's China or another country. Seventh, Australia should think out of the box in relation to defense requirements to foster more independent and self-reliant defense and foreign policy that safeguards its national interests and protects its sovereignty. Eighth, Australia must work to be more closely integrated with its Southeast Asian counterparts and South Pacific neighbors with whom Australians share close economic, security, and environmental interests. And the final point that I'd like to make, and this is a controversial suggestion and point which I make in my book, but nevertheless, I think that there is some merit in exploring this issue and talking about the issues related to this in a more transparent and open way. And that is imagining an Australian-China security agreement. In my book, I go through the pros and cons of this in greater detail, but suffice to say that despite the current challenges and stiff opposition over the last few years, entering into discussions on an Australia-China security treaty, or at least forging closer military ties with China, could be the apex of Australia's new China policy in the Asian century. And moreover, I frame this as an application of the Keating concept, Paul Keating's concept, that we should find, Australian government, should find our security in and not from Asia. So that concludes my brief presentation on Australia's future China policy. And I hope that everyone got something out of this presentation. And I look forward to everyone having the opportunity to read more and discuss some of these issues that I have outlined and presented in my book and in this presentation as well. So I'm going to hand it back to JD, and he's going to take over, and he will move on with some Q&A.
Thanks, David. That is a sweeping summary of 50 years of various government of Australia in their policy formulation, implementation, dealing with China. And I very much like your use of very succinct words to characterize each government, a particular unique approach. But I can see there are variations from government to government, and maybe the coalition government and the Labour government share some commonalities, but also have different emphasis on how they should manage their China policy. And I should point out and also encourage people to read this book because I think perhaps the unique feature of this book is extensive use of primary sources. And David has managed to interview all the living former Australian prime ministers, I think bar one, and many foreign ministers, and many of them maybe more than once. So of course he has had this access to how the leaders, top Australian leaders, think about China and think about how Australia can and should manage this very important relationship, and how they have managed during their tenures in government, leading the government, handle the various challenges, and then to present a relatively persistent or consistent policy toward China. And out of their convictions, taking into consideration of the global kind of constrained structural development, the rise of China, the growing influence of China, and the fact that China has become a significant player in many countries' economic development, because China basically has become the largest trading partners for almost all Asian countries. So that is very unique feature there. So we have already lots of questions are coming in. So I encourage you to post your question in the